All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Apologies for the long gap in episodes. Got a lot of family health issues going on right now, and yeah, so I missed a couple days. I might miss a few more coming up, but this is an educational channel, and we try to focus in on great theories and discoveries and angles and magnum opuses and tour de forces that you probably have never heard of because they've been suppressed because of their explosive nature, that they could really wake you up to what's really going on, and to give you some direction about where to look and so on. We've been doing a lot of Bible decodes. This is number 269, and these are all coming from the New Testament. We've been focusing on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, and they wrote the New Testament in whole or in part as a psychological operation against the Jews, and we've covered almost all angles of that theory over the last 200 or so videos. And we are looking at a kind of a side adjacent theory right now from an author named Robert Eisenman, and he was very instrumental in liberating the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s and 50s in a series of caves near Qumran, which is about 20 miles southeast of Jerusalem. And in those caves, they found all these scrolls that were in various states of repair and that had been that are subject to some dispute about when they were written. Most scholars nowadays, I think that they came from the 1st century AD. At the time, the scholars were basically given custody, or the scrolls were under the custody of these Dominican monks or Dominican priests who obviously saw something they didn't like as they started to translate these scrolls. Most of them were in Hebrew, a few in Aramaic, and just a handful in Greek. And they started to translate them and kind of put them together because some of them were in various states of repair. Like a jigsaw puzzle, you have to put the pieces together and then try to read it. And this official team that was supposed to be translating and disseminating these materials didn't do so, and they just kept kicking the can down the road for almost 40 years. It got to be that the people that were licking their chops to get on, the scholars, theologians who were licking their chops to get their hands on these historic documents, lived and died and never saw them because these monks basically, or these priests basically suppressed them. And it took until the late 1980s when Robert Eisenman and a few others kind of forced them out, at least photographs of them, to get out to scholars. By that time, a lot of people didn't even know what these things were because it had been, somewhat of a cause célèbre back 40 years before that, but by then, you know, a lot of the people weren't even alive when they were first discovered. Anyway, so Eisenman has a thorough grasp of these Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are just copies of Old Testament books. All of the Old Testament books are included amongst the scrolls, except for, I believe, the Book of Esther, and most of that material is non-controversial, because outside of a word here or a word there, the translations are pretty much, you know, they're copies. Now, they're historic because these are the oldest copies of these Old Testament books that are in existence by a long shot. But they're not explosive in that they don't contain a lot of material that, like, scholars haven't seen before. Now, there is a lot of other material within the cache of these Dead Sea Scrolls that are explosive, because they are what they call sectarian material. They were written by the sect, or this small group of very pious monks, more or less, that were living in this monastery at Qumran, very ascetic and strict rules. And these are the sectarian material, are the documents that they put together that kind of describe who they were, what they believed in, what their goals were, and so on. So there are things like a document called the Community Rule, and then there's the Damascus document, and then there's the War Scroll and the Temple Scroll. And these were very important because they shed light on what first century life was like for these monks living at Qumran, and what was important to them, what was meaningful to them. And it's also very important because our understanding of the first century, especially given the Roman origins hypothesis, because if you recognize that the Gospels were written by the Romans, and that you can determine that by reading Josephus, especially Josephus's War of the Jews in 7 volumes, and so you know, that breaks the code that informs you that the Gospels are fraud. Whoever wrote Josephus is also the author of the New Testament. We know that Josephus was a member of the Roman, the Flavian dynasty. He's known as Flavius Josephus by adoption. And he was writing from Caesar's palace, and his books were endorsed by Emperor Titus, and spread out by Emperor Titus. And so if we know that, then we recognize that not only is the New Testament fiction, but Josephus is also fiction, or we would say propaganda, war propaganda, or a psychological operation. And those are really our only 2 sources, major sources that we can use to reconstruct the events of the first century, especially Josephus, which claims to be history. And so if we can't rely on those things, the Dead Sea Scrolls really does fill a vacuum of, like, what the hell was going on in the first century. Now, these Dominican priests claim that these documents, they are trying to distance these documents from Christianity. So they are, you know, citing archaeology discoveries and paleographic discoveries, which is kind of like the analysis of handwriting over the years, which really does seem like pseudoscience. But they cited those kind of sources as evidence that the scrolls were written way back in the 2nd century BC. Eisenman has problems with that, and that's where we're going to tune in right here. This is we're still in the introduction, I believe, and this book here is called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And Eisenman, I believe, is pretty sympathetic to the Roman origins hypothesis, but at the time that he's writing this book, in the 90s, early 90s, I think, I have to check, I'll check the date, maybe the mid 90s, he is not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis. So I think one of his main arguments is that, you know, these groups, these different groups, the Zealots and the Dead Sea Scrolls people and the early Christians and the Zadokites, they're all referring to the same people, kind of from different. It's like you know, looking at an elephant from different you know, different body parts. Okay, so it should be appreciated that Qumran exegetical interpretation raises the clear presumption of a 1st century provenance for most sectarian materials, most Qumran sectarian materials. This is as true of the exegesis of Habakkuk 2:4, and there is a lot of material in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are what you call peshers, or exegeses of Habakkuk and some other books of the Old Testament. So this is as true of the exegesis of Habakkuk 2:4, including the notice about the delay of parousia, which precedes it, as it is for the citation of the star prophecy, which Josephus definitively connects with the uprising against Rome, and which all available evidence attests was in the air from the 40s to the 60s CE and beyond. Now, the star prophecy is the prophecy written about by the Jews, when they give a prophecy to someone that they will one day become the emperor or the king or some such. Now, the star prophecy I thought was originally only intended to be used on Jews, but our evidence of the star prophecy, especially in this time period that he's talking about, is Josephus. Josephus was originally a Jewish military commander in this war of the Jews and the Romans from 66 to 73 AD. And he surrendered to Emperor Vespasian, or General Vespasian, before he actually became the first Flavian emperor. He surrendered to Vespasian, and at that point he recognized in his mind that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so Josephus defected to the Romans, and he gave Vespasian the star prophecy. I foresee that one day you will become the new emperor. And so when Vespasian did become the new emperor, he pardoned Josephus and brought him to Rome, adopted him as a member of his family, made him the court historian, and put him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace. Now, this would never happen. The Romans were famous for dragging the opposing military commanders through the streets before they fed them to the dogs or, otherwise killed them in front of the screaming throngs at what they called the triumph. Now, this exact same star prophecy was also given by Yohanan ben Zakkai, the founder of the rabbinical school of Judaism at the campus at land grant campus at Jaffna, by the land granted by Vespasian to Ben Zakkai, who gave Vespasian also the star prophecy, although it might have been Titus, but regardless, one of them, he gave it, said that one day you will become emperor. And so the Romans hooked him up with a kind of a land grant so that he could build this college for the Pharisaic Jews to engage in endless amounts of scriptural debate about the Old Testament scriptures. This was another psychological operation by the Romans against the Jews to basically to mellow them out, to get them to be less militaristic and aggressive, because the Romans had colonized the Jews, and the Jews were super high maintenance for them. Now, but also the star prophecy, as far as I can tell, at least I believe this is in Josephus, and so it can't be taken seriously, just like the rest of these star prophecies can't be taken seriously. But there was a star prophecy from Herod, from some of the zealot Jews to Herod the Great, Herod the King, who they predicted he would become one day emperor. Now, this was in a much earlier period, 1st century BC. So I don't know why Eisenman doesn't bring that matter up, but he uses the citation of the star prophecy as evidence for this later provenance for the Dead Sea Scrolls of the 1st century, because he says all available evidence attests the star prophecy was in the air from the 40s to the 60s AD and beyond. And so the delay of as it is for the citation of the star prophecy, upwards of 3 times in the extant corpus, once in connection with the messianic reign imagery described above, the reference to the true prophet proof text of Deuteronomy 18:15, well known in Jewish Christian tradition, and the application of Lebanon imagery to the fall of the temple, which definitively ties to the fall of the temple in 70 AD, and that was as a result of the siege of Jerusalem from Titus, where he fulfills Jesus' prophecies for the destruction of the temple, and that would be a marker of his second coming, meaning that Titus was the second coming of Jesus, and that all of our attempts to contort the book of Revelation to make it seem like it's happening now is folly, and that the events of the book of Revelation occurred actually in the late 1st century AD. In addition, there is the implied presence of the terminology of Isaiah 53:11 in the very structure of Qumran organization itself, as well as in Qumran eschatological exegesis of Ezekiel 44:15. I like that little alliteration there. Eschatological exegesis of Ezekiel. 44:15 and Habakkuk 2:4, and the fairly large collection of Qumran allusions, including the Way, which Luke identifies as an alternative name for 1st century Christianity in Palestine. The poor, the meek. Now these are from Dead Sea Scrolls allusions, referring to themselves, because to live there at Qumran you had to kind of give away all of your possessions, and they were also celibate. the only children that they had there were like adopted. Um, okay, and then the Day of Judgment, works, the last end, all with a very fairly well attested first century provenance. Then what principally holds researchers back from arriving at such conclusions? Aside from a strong psychological and spiritual predisposition not to arrive at such results, the answer is to be found in the supposedly secure results paleographers and archaeologists have claimed for themselves. Here, a small group of specialists, largely working together, developed a consensus which was used to press the provenance of the most important Qumran sectarian texts back into the 1st and sometimes even the 2nd century BC. Just push it as far away from Christianity as possible so that they're not equated to one another. Now, Eisenman and other scholars, Barbara Thiering, they claim that the events discussed in the sectarian material of the Dead Sea Scrolls is directly related to the events of Christianity. I would argue that those events may be the inspiration or the root kind of text for the psychological operation that the Romans used that they called Christianity, and so they might have drawn from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the major plot or the characters, there is the teacher of righteousness, there is the wicked priest, and then there is the liar. And like the wicked priest is like an outsider who kind of persecutes the teacher of righteousness and his followers. And then there is the liar, who is really an insider to the group, who is kind of like a backstabber. So there's a lot of different interpretations of Jesus as the teacher of righteousness, but also some people think it was John the Baptist. And Eisenman, for his, he believes that it was James, the brother of Jesus, who was the teacher of righteousness. And then the wicked priest is seen by some as maybe being Paul or possibly Judas. There's a lot of people who are attempting to kind of fit the Dead Sea Scrolls into the New Testament narratives. In lieu of clear historical insight or a firm textual grasp, preconceptions and reconstructions, such as they were stated as facts, and these results, which were used to corroborate each other, in turn became new assumptions that were used to draw away a whole generation of students unwilling or simply unable to question the work of their mentors. The archaeological evidence they used was mainly based on a questionable treatment of coin data, while the flaws in paleography, subject notorious for its imprecision. Again, that is like the analysis of trends in penmanship over the decades. And to be able to try to pin down the penmanship to a specific time period is very dubious, in my limited opinion on the subject. They were mainly connected with F.M. Cross's and S. Birnbaum's assumption of a, quote, rapid straight line development of scripts. In fact, where paleographic sequences are concerned and the rather simplistic straight line functions developed to describe these, The situation is probably far more uneven and complex than either scholar originally envisioned, and historical and textual studies will be able to do much to clarify these, not vice versa. Right. So he's really saying, like, the text, let's stick with the text. Like, stop bringing in all this extraneous stuff that is peripheral to the text, the archaeology and the penmanship. That's relevant, but, like, the text is what we're really looking at here, and you guys are kind of presenting this sideshow to back these documents up by 100 or 200 years. Despite the fact that a majority of concerned persons do not appear to have seriously examined the various positions of those principally responsible for this consensus or their methodologies, this consensus has been allowed to stand. Therefore, I have felt obliged to treat and criticize their arguments and conclusions in detail in the latter part of this work, particularly in the footnotes. In providing an alternative historical and textual framework in which to fit the most important Qumran sectarian documents, it is hoped that most of the preconceptions that have dominated Qumran research for so long will fade away, and that new ideas will be brought into play and previously unused sources given their proper scope. When this is done, individual beings, the facts of whose lives tradition has distorted beyond recognition, or who have been consigned to historical oblivion, spring immediately to life, and a whole block of associated historical fabrications and accusations evaporate. Okay, now, that is true. Okay, now he just gives a few more acknowledgments to people who helped him in his research at the end of this introduction, and he's writing this way back in 1983. So at that time, Eisenman was probably one of the only people who even did have access to these texts. Now, I'm reading this book because it is in a compilation that Eisenman comes out with later that is called the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And so that book came out in the 90s, but this book must have come out in the mid-1980s. Okay, now he's probably going to go over a lot of the points that I've been trying to make rather inarticulately here in Chapter 1, which is called Qumran Research. Over and over again in Qumran research, one comes upon the assertion that one or another of the Maccabee family had some connection with the wicked priest and or the spouter of lies. Now, if you don't remember, the Maccabees were a dynasty of Jewish kings that basically liberated Jerusalem from the Seleucids, who were like Greek Syrians that controlled Jerusalem in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. And the Maccabees came along in approximately 167 BC, and they overthrew the Seleucids and they ruled Jerusalem, and they gave, Judea, and they gave Judea its sovereignty for about a century until they were dethroned by Pompey and the Romans in 63 BC. And this is the subject of the apocryphal books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that are actually in the canon with some sects, but mostly are apocryphal Old Testament books. Okay, so he's saying a lot of the Qumran research points to that the Maccabees or their descendants are related to the wicked priest and or the spouter of lies. Furthermore, it is claimed that the Maccabee family, including even Mattathias or Judas Maccabeus, usurped the high priesthood from an earlier, purer line known as the Zadokites. And the Zadokites were from Zadok, the priest dating all the way back to King David, at least King Solomon. And so this was a dynasty of priests, high priests. These ideas have, on the whole, dominated Dead Sea Scroll research, but they are at variance with the evidence found at Qumran itself, including material in the Book of Enoch, which is an apocryphal work, Daniel, and the Testament of Levi. They display a curious insensitivity to the true meanings and origins of the Sadducee, Zealot, and Christian, or what in Palestine would probably be called the Messianic movements. Josephus is usually taken at face value with little attempt to analyze the data he provides beyond a superficial comparison of it with other known facts. Where religious movements were concerned, however, he was a self-serving and inadequate observer. Now, I would broaden that to not just where religious movements were concerned, but with everything that he wrote. He was a self-serving and inadequate observer. Like the final redactors of the Gospels, whose contemporary he was at pains to avoid certain potentially incriminating facts. In his case, his own association with the Zealot and or Messianic movements. Now, I would contend that Josephus really never existed and that he was just a pen name that was used by the Romans. But he does have an autobiography called Vita, where he describes how he was, at one point, he was an Essene, who I don't believe existed either, but he was an Essene, and then he became a Pharisee, and I think he was also said he was a Sadducee. And, a lot of the things that he writes about in his autobiography just are fantastically untrue, that they just couldn't be true. He talks about, that's in one of his other, not just his autobiography, all of his core